Old cemetery. What can you find interesting in an old cemetery? Mysterious steles and tombs are certainly present, and they look quite mystical. But few people pay attention to the most important mystery of the old cemeteries. All the old cemeteries are not really that ancient. A rare cemetery has an age of more than 200 years. For example, the history of Warsaw has several hundred centuries. So, in the oldest cemeteries of this city, there must be burials of at least the 15th or 16th centuries. But in Warsaw, not only are there no graves of the 16th centuries, there are not even cemeteries with such dating. The oldest cemetery in Warsaw was founded in 1790. The population of Warsaw in 1700 was 30,000 people. It seems to be a little, but these people were also dying, and they needed places in the cemetery. But there was no cemetery in Warsaw at that time. It's been almost 100 years. The population of the city has increased by 100,000 people. And only then, a cemetery was built in Warsaw. And where were people buried before that? After all, it was a Christian city, and people had to be buried according to Christian customs. Let's assume that for some reason, Christians in Poland did not bury people in cemeteries, but performed some other rite. But there are also no old cemeteries and other confessions in Poland. The oldest Jewish cemetery in Wrocław is also, in fact, not very ancient. It was founded in the second half of the 19th century. There are, of course, very interesting cemeteries in Poland. Here, for example, is the Mennonite Cemetery. It was founded in 1690. This is one of the oldest cemeteries in Poland, some of the tombstones of which are dated 1691st year. But this cemetery also raises questions. At the end of the 16th century, the Mennonites living in the Netherlands, representatives of one of the branches of Protestantism, left their country as a result of persecution, and some settled in Poland. It turns out that people moved to Poland and only 100 years after moving, founded a cemetery. Did they not die at all during this period? Muslims have a similar story. Muslims have lived on Polish soil for more than 600 years. But the oldest tombstone in the Muslim cemetery in the village of Kruszyniany in the Podlaski Voivodeship dates back to 1699th year. It is a very strange situation. People have been living permanently in certain territories for several hundred years. And it doesn't matter where it is, in Paris, Warsaw, or Moscow. Religion is also not important: Christians, Muslims, and Jews. They began to build the first cemetery only at the end of the 17th century, and before that period, they either did not die at all, or did not occupy these territories. About immortality, of course, I got excited, but about whether people lived in these places until the end of the 17th century. The question is, of course, very interesting, but this completely refutes the entire official history. Therefore, let's imagine that they still lived on the territories of Poland and Moscow until the 17th century. And of course, this is confirmed by thousands of historical documents. But here's what's strange: there are thousands of documents, and everyone tells and confirms the presence of people here before the 17th century. But despite all these documents, people seem to live both in Warsaw and in Moscow, but for some reason they did not die. Or vice versa, they died, but for some reason they were not buried in cemeteries. Why weren't they buried in cemeteries? After all, we know about all the major religions of that period. These are Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And all these religions have no prohibition to bury people in the ground. The population of Moscow and Warsaw has increased rapidly, but the cemetery appears only at the end of the 17th century. It turns out to be some kind of historical mystery. There are thousands of mounds on the territory of Eurasia, which historians date back to the last millennium. People are buried in these mounds. So, in the last millennium, people were buried in mounds instead of cemeteries. Rather, the mounds were such peculiar cemeteries. One could also agree with this, but the relatively small number of mounds for a thousand-year history is confusing. There are thousands of mounds, but it is a drop in the ocean compared to the number of people who have lived and died on the territory of Eurasia over the past 2,000 years. And we still have a very large time gap between the period when people were still buried in mounds and the onset of those times when people began to be buried in cemeteries, and this gap is from 500 to 1,000 years. It turns out that for at least 500 years, people have not been buried at all in mounds because the era of mounds has ended, not in cemeteries because the era of cemeteries has not yet come. And most importantly, one would think that people could be buried simply in unmarked graves. But this theory is not confirmed either. If all the previous generations over the last 1,000 years had been in the ground, then thousands of bones would have been found during any construction. But this is not happening. Sometimes, of course, bones are found, but very rarely. If you look at the data of historians, the population in 1340th year was about 150 million people. Then, from 1340th year to 1350th, there was a sharp decrease in the population by 50 million people. So, in just 10 years from 1340th to 1350th, 50 million people should be devoted to the earth. So over the last 1,000 years, hundreds of millions of bodies must have been buried in the ground. But for some reason, human bones in excavations are quite rare. Cemeteries were opened only at the end of the 17th century. Where did hundreds of millions go? There is another place, the catacombs. For example, the catacombs of Paris could absorb several million bodies, but even the oldest catacombs for the burial of bodies appear only in the 16th century. These are the Capuchin catacombs under the old church of Santa Maria delle Paces on the island of Sicily. Even if we include the catacombs in history, we still have a huge gap between the burials. From the 5th century AD to the 15th century, during this period, they are no longer buried in mounds, and are not yet buried in catacombs and cemeteries. Skeletons are not found en masse in the fields either. It turns out some kind of paradox. People lived, wrote birch bark letters, scientific works on parchment, but after that, they seem to evaporate. Where did hundreds of millions of skeletons disappear to? They disappeared because the bones are very well preserved in the ground, and no one is surprised by a skeleton that is more than 1,000 years old. Of course, you can blame everything on the flood. A big wave passed at the end of the 16th century and covered all the old cemeteries with a multi-meter layer of soil. The wave version is good, but if we agree with it, then what should we do with the mounds? The flood covered all the cemeteries, but for some reason did not touch the mounds. In general, there is a good version with the global wave, but it is very contradictory. We need a theory that can explain the absence of cemeteries and at the same time will not destroy the world of mounds. And here on the forum in Stolen History, I saw very interesting information. In the 1870s, a movement arose in Europe for the introduction of cremation to get rid of human bodies. In 1869th year, this idea was presented at the International Medical Congress in Florence by Professors Coletti and Castilian. A model of Brunetti's cremation apparatus, along with the resulting ashes, was exhibited at the Vienna exhibition in 1873 year. There doesn't seem to be anything interesting in this news. We decided at the end of the 19th century to make cremation fashionable. What is surprising here, and how is this related to the fact that we have no human remains for the last 1,000 years? To understand that these things are connected, look at the crematorium project from an American magazine. Very much resembles the Acropolis in Athens. Only here, the crematorium has another interesting tower or pipe. Here we have a longitudinal section of this structure. A high pipe is clearly visible. It seems that there is no such pipe on the Acropolis in Athens now, but there is no tower in the Acropolis of Athens now. It was there quite recently. The Frankish Tower, built on the Acropolis of Athens as part of the Palace of the Dukes of Athens. The date of construction is unknown. The Frankish Tower was demolished in 1874 year on the initiative and with funding from Heinrich Schliemann. It's a very strange story. All I've heard about Schliemann before is that this archaeologist found the mythical Troy. But for some reason, in Athens, Schliemann finances the demolition of an interesting historical object. The destruction of such a significant object caused a lot of criticism in the press. King George I of Greece ordered the demolition of the tower, but for some reason, the tower was still demolished. In the process, Schliemann had more power than the Greek king. Now let's return to the project of the crematorium of the late 19th century. This is a crematorium. And this is the Athenian Propylaeum. This is where the tower was located. Now let's look at the Père Lachaise crematorium in France, which was erected in 1880. And here is the crematorium in Hamburg. Look at the tower. There was a similar one in Athens, and most importantly, very similar to the Arsenal Tower in New York. It means that not only weapons were stored in the arsenals, but they could also burn bodies. Crematorium in Mainz. Crematoriums were not invented at the end of the 19th century, as historians are trying to convince us. In 1869 year, Professor Coletti simply revealed to us the real purpose of ancient buildings. It looks like a huge part of religious buildings throughout Europe were used as crematoriums. And that's why we don't have cemeteries until the end of the 17th century. It seems that there was another religion in Eurasia. The bodies were not buried and were always burned. Therefore, there are a lot of religious buildings, next to which there are high towers, and a lot of historical buildings decorated with urns for ashes. A foreign religion ruled in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, and strange buildings and urns with ashes on the roofs remained of this cult. That's it. Watch my channel.